Thanks, and thank you everyone for coming and staying till the end. So my job is to talk a little bit about clinical trials, just understanding where we are, how to get on a clinical trial, and just an overall end to this day with a feeling of hope that there is more that's happening that you can be part of and more that will happen. So these are some disclosures. And I thought we'd cover a little bit of statistics, not just about neuroendocrine cancers, but cancer as a whole, and look at some of the major advances of the past year in cancer in general. You've heard from Dr. Nakakura all the advances that happened right here just in the last couple of days, and then share with you how drugs really are developed and just some basics about how to get in a clinical trial for those of you who have not been in a clinical trial. A little bit about the questions we're trying to ask, and the importance of health-related patient-reported health outcomes and quality of life, and end with a couple of other points about funding, advocacy, and a couple of takeaways. So cancer trends in the United States, 1.7 million people received a cancer diagnosis in 2017. And if you look today, 1 out of every 20 people has been told you have cancer and is a survivor. And if you look back in 1975, only about 35% of those people who were diagnosed then lived 10 years or more. But today, 64% of the US patients who are living with cancer were diagnosed more than 10 years ago. So survival has really increased. And when you look at all cancers, though, in terms of, how do I go back? When you look at all cancers, it's sort of increasing for a number of years and then more or less flat. But neuroendocrine cancers, the yellow line, as Jennifer showed earlier, are actually increasing. And that is why these meetings are occurring. More conversations and need for therapies is happening. So in terms of advances that we have made over the last decade or so, if you just did a simple search in terms of journal articles, which is where we all get our knowledge, and perhaps you do too, if you just searched using the word cancer, in the title, the number of articles you will find have quadrupled in just the last decade. There were about 28,000 articles in 2007, and now it's over 120,000 articles. That means research, trials, things are getting done and published. And these new treatments have all been shown to improve average survival for melanoma, for ovarian cancer, lung, bladder, many, many cancers that were once thought to be very, very short surviving type of diagnoses. Great progress has been made. And why does this matter to all of you? Because some of those lessons, some of those drugs that we're learning how to use in those cancers will eventually be studied, or perhaps are already being studied in neuroendocrine tumors. And what's most important is that within a span of 1 year, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, approved 31 new therapies between 2016 and 17 for 16 different types of cancers. And when you look at neuroendocrine cancers, all 6 drugs that we have right now have been approved in the last 5 years. 2 of the big things that happened in this past year, one was adoptive cell immunotherapy. It's a word that Elise just alluded to a little bit, called CAR T-cell therapy, and I'll talk about it for just a moment, was recognized as the ASCO, our American Society for Clinical Oncology, Advance of the Year, a big, big step forward for all of us. And another big discovery last year was something called a tumor agnostic therapy. So in addition to finding drugs, we also have to look at how we do the whole approval process. And the FDA for the first time said for a couple of different drugs, we don't need you to prove that it works in neuroendocrine and lung and bladder. If there is a genetic mutation that's common across all of these patients and the drug works in patients who have that mutation, that's what we call tumor agnostic, we will allow you to use that treatment for all of those patients. And that was a big step forward in the approval process itself. So what is this adoptive cell immunotherapy? A big grant was given by NetRF this year to a group to study this and develop this for neuroendocrine cancers. And we are very excited about it because it's a very natural way of treating cancer. What they do is remove the blood from the patient's own blood T cells from their own blood and essentially train these cells. We call them CAR T cells, chimeric antigen receptor. So they're able to recognize the tumor better, and then they multiply them outside the body and return them into the patient and allow that to work and treat and help hopefully cure some of these patients. And this actually has been successful for childhood leukemias, lymphomas, myelomas, and actually this lady, Melinda Bikini, has bile duct cancer. And she's from Montana and had run out of all her options and decided to travel to NIH and get on one of these trials. And she attributes her success and survival, being a 10-year survivor now of a disease that has an average survival of a year, all because she participated in a clinical trial. So how do trials actually come to be? When a drug is developed in the lab, someone comes up with an idea. Between 10,000 and 15,000 different compounds are screened and studied, and only around 200, 250 of them look like candidates, like they're actually working. And of that, 5 lead compounds that are safe in animal models are finally chosen to develop and go further into patients. So prior to that first clinical trial that we call a phase 1 trial, usually this discovery, and we call it preclinical before it comes to the clinic phase, runs 3 to 6 years, give or take. And usually these clinical trials, from the time they open, phase 1 studies, initially to find the dose and the safety, then the phase 2 studies to see is it working, and finally the phase 3 study to say, yes, it's really better than what we currently have, takes between 6 to 10 years sometimes. And that's when the FDA looks at those results and says, okay, I think this is right. I think this is good for this patient population. You may go ahead and use it. Even then, after that, there is post-approval monitoring to make sure it's being given correctly and people are getting it the way they were supposed to. And we call that phase 4. So what is a phase 1 study? A phase 1 study is one where we're looking at safety. We're looking to find out what dose to give. We guess more or less from what we think in mouse studies, animal studies, different species, what we think will be safe. But we generally try to start a little bit lower and then increase. And for some of these studies, we also want to know what schedule to give. Should we give it 2 weeks on, 1 week off? Should we give it continuously? And we do those kinds of things and draw blood to understand how much the drug was in your system, exposure achieved. And sometimes a phase 1 study is called phase 1, even though the 2 drugs that are being tested are already approved or we already know how to give them, because we're trying to combine them. And now we're trying to see, do we need to decrease the dose of any one of them because the 2 together might be more toxic? And that's also called a phase 1 study. Most of these are not usually disease specific. They can be for all patients. Phase 2 studies are more disease specific. So now you already know the dose, and in that phase 1, maybe you had some neuroendocrine patients, some were lung cancers, but a lot of the neuroendocrine patients did really well, or you think this is the disease where there are more of those mutations that you're targeting. So it's a more disease specific trial. Now you're looking for efficacy. Efficacy means, did it benefit you? Did it improve the time till the disease grew or progressed? Sometimes these phase 2 studies have biomarkers where they're drawing blood or they're taking tissue samples or sequential biopsies to try and understand who responded, who didn't respond. And here again, they're looking for safety because sometimes patients have some organ dysfunction, liver failure. They want to understand, is it safe? And a lot of times there's quality of life questions as well. Phase 3 is the next step. Assuming phase 1 and 2 have gone well, you've seen some results that are promising, and now these studies tend to be multi-center. And the reason they do them in many centers is because the results from one hospital need to be extrapolatable, need to be applicable to the larger masses. And these are always disease specific, and here you're trying to confirm what you already know. Good or bad in these studies, these are compared to what is current standard to show that this is superior, and sometimes there is no standard, so we use a placebo. And that sometimes can be a little unsettling for patients, but without that, it's really hard to prove that the drug has actually had benefit. But thankfully for neuroendocrine patients, given the slower biology, scans are done in a couple of months. So if it's not working for you, certainly moving over to the active drug or a different therapy is an option. Some of these phase 3 studies are now becoming smaller. Traditionally, we used to need hundreds and hundreds of patients, but these are getting a little smaller because we're finding out how to select patients for studies, and we call that biomarker-selected population. And by that, what we mean is we see some signal, some mutation, some receptor present, and that increases the likelihood that you're going to benefit. So instead of looking for a 10% difference or a 20% difference, we're looking for something much bigger, 30, 40, 50%. And for that, you don't need as many patients. And most of the FDA approvals have come from phase 3 studies, but occasionally where exceptional responses were seen, drugs have been approved with just phase 1 and 2. So from the pharmaceutical company's perspective, I know there are a few people here in the audience and are actively doing this kind of work. Before a drug even gets brought to a patient, they have to do something called an investigational new drug application, an IND, meaning the FDA is not going to let you take something that you think worked very well in your lab and give it to a patient unless you can show in multiple different species, mice, rats, larger animals, rabbits, dogs, whatever, that it is safe, that it is not toxic. And they also want to show that you have the methods of how you're going to produce the drug reproducibly in a very sterile way, and its shelf life is good, meaning once you start the trial and you have a patient on and they're doing great and they need the drug for 2 years, this drug better be good when it sits in the shelf, at what temperature, all that you have to show them before you start the trial. You don't want to have someone starting and then 6 months into it saying, I don't know if I have enough for you for the rest of the year. So they have to prove all that before the trial starts. And then once it starts, they need to have methods in place to measure how much there is in the blood and how much exposure was achieved and so on and so forth. And that's when the application is filed, and after approval, they continue to monitor toxicities. So even if you're getting something that's approved, we have to report back to tell them, oh yes, this gentleman did have this toxicity. Was it related to the drug? Was it expected? So on and so forth. So how would you know if you should participate in a clinical trial? The first and foremost thing that you would want to look at is, am I eligible? So what kind of neuroendocrine tumor? Some trials are specific for lung nets. There is a trial going on right now at Georgetown looking at immunotherapy plus PRRT, and it's for all grades of lung nets. Receptor expression. For a trial relating to PRRT, they're going to want to know if the tumor actually has uptake of the gallium dotatate or octreotide. Some studies will limit or require you to have had certain numbers of prior therapies. And by that I mean Dr. Chan's study looking at cabozantinib is designed to help people who have already previously had Afinitor or everolimus. So they'll ask you, have you had everolimus before? And if you say no, they'll say, well, then maybe not right now, but a little bit down the road. And for most studies, to show benefit, because this is such an indolent cancer, they want to see if the disease is growing. Is it progressing? Because if you're doing well on sandostatin or lanreotide, maybe you don't need anything right now. So those kinds of questions will come up, and your doctor can help you figure that out. Insurance approval. Even though the drugs are often provided and free, many aspects of the trial, like the doctor's visit, the routine CBC, etc., that are standard of care are billed to insurance. So we want to make sure the insurance is okay with that. We don't want you getting a bill after the fact. For many of you, the question may also be, is there a placebo arm or not? And patients are always a little bit anxious when there's placebos involved, but once they see the big picture and they look at their other options, that might seem like the right choice for you. And what phase of study? Generally, a phase 3 study is a building on existing evidence that this therapy actually works. And you may want to be on a phase 3 study when you're facing an option of phase 3 or phase 2. But sometimes a phase 2 makes more sense based on what you've had before, or even a phase 1. Distance. Some of you live here. Some of you have traveled a big distance to come here. And you have to be practical. There's a lot of blood draws, weekly therapy. Is it really possible for you to live somewhere that you don't have support in family? Is also a consideration. Risk versus benefit. Once you hear about the toxicities, you may say, oh, I don't know if I can do that. Risk of neuropathy, I already have neuropathy. I'm a musician. I can't afford to have more neuropathy, or whatever. Comorbidities. Some drugs can worsen blood sugar levels. If you're already diabetic and having a hard time controlling your sugars, that might not be the right therapy for you. And of course, last but probably the most important is a discussion with the people you trust. There's no wrong decision. There's just a right decision at a different time in your life. And so that conversation with your own team is important. So I'll give you an example. For all of these criteria, we have a patient that we're caring for right now, Mr. SG. He has an atypical lung neuroendocrine tumor. He lives in Rochester, New York, about an hour and 15 minutes from Buffalo. He's had multiple different lines of therapy and has had toxicities from several of them. And he came for an opinion because he read about this trial, this immune vaccine trial that we have, looking at a survivin vaccine. It's an immune vaccine. It's a drug that basically is designed to go and reduce the amount of this protein, survivin, which is anti-apoptosis, which means it tells the cells normally in the body, it's telling the cells, don't die. And so this vaccine is trying to say, no, this is a cancer cell, let it die. And that's what this vaccine is designed to do. So he was interested in participating, and in terms of the type of net, location, receptor expression, he had to be screened. We had to take a piece of his biopsy and look to see whether it had the expression of survivin, and it did. So that made him eligible. And they also want to see that the patient is having some disease progression. But at the moment, his disease is not progressing. So he's not participating, but he will come back and see us in a couple of weeks, and we'll see if his disease has started to grow. And that's when he can sign up and be in the study. He doesn't have any other options left. He's had pretty much everything. There's no placebo, and that's making him interested in participating. We're only an hour from him, and he has to come every 2 weeks in the beginning, so it's not too onerous for him and his family. So that's sort of how his decision is being made. So then how do you find a clinical trial? Let's just say it's time. You have had some disease growth. Simplest, ask your doctor. Seek a second opinion if your doctor is not working in a center that offers clinical trials. And sometimes your own doctor can guide you because he or she must have worked with someone else in the NET field and may tell you, go see this doctor or that one. If you're here, it's pretty easy. You can go to Dana-Farber and they might be able to find you the right trial. Another great resource that we all use is clinicaltrials.gov. If you're working with a fellow, your doctor, anyone in the team, you can ask them for some help with the search terms because sometimes it's not that easy to find. Talk to people, social media, sometimes even insurance companies have people on their helpline that can guide you. There are various organizations that fund research, and they list the trials that they have recently funded. And that's another place to learn what's hot and what's exciting in the field. And it's stressful to do this by yourself. And I'm sure some of you as caregivers have taken that role upon yourselves to do some of this research and be the designated person. And there are others, people that perhaps you haven't thought of asking. Some of these young people, they need a project. You just give them a task and they're happy to do this for you. So they can search and organize things and make little tables. And I've seen patients coming with binders that have been put together by a niece or a neighbor. So that might be something. And for if there's someone in the audience with a pheochromocytoma or a paraganglioma, at the NIH, there's a very designated big effort for parapheo that Dr. Paycheck is doing. And if you need to look at what's coming up, that might be a good place. It's a long wait to get in, but if it's urgent, he will get you in. So I thought I'd just show you how to do a search on clinicaltrials.gov. This is what the website looks like. And you can pick whether you want all studies or you want just recruiting and not yet recruiting. When you say all, they'll tell you even the studies that are closed. So maybe you want to do the search for what's recruiting and not yet recruiting, meaning it's going to open soon. And here I just did the search for Massachusetts, United States, neuroendocrine tumors, and Boston. You can choose the distance you wish to travel. And this is what came up. The trials that are recruiting, not yet recruiting, and the third one, the cabozantinib treating patients with NETs who've previously failed everolimus versus placebo was one that I picked to sort of focus on a little bit more. So this is what you would see if you clicked on that. It would list all the different types of tumors that patients would have to be eligible, which pretty much is every neuroendocrine tumor. And then there are these eligibility criteria. That list is rather long, but even if you just printed that and took it to your oncologist and asked them to see if you're eligible and find you the closest center, that would be something that would make it easier for you to participate. So what are the other trials and questions that all of us are asking as physicians and care providers? These questions came from you, but from discussions as teams. So I'll walk through this little circle here one by one. So on the top right corner, we're looking at ways to compare existing therapies. Once you get a couple of options, you want to know which one should I use first. Would it be better to do A and B or B and A, and would that be better for patients? And so one of those questions in high-grade neuroendocrine cancers as first line we're trying to ask is platinum and etoposide IV as a first option better, or should we be giving pills with capecitabine and temozolomide? We have everolimus, we have PRRT. We're trying to answer, should we do one or the other first when people have tumor growth? There's a trial currently going on called NETTER-2. PRRT was approved based on results from NETTER-1. And here we're looking to see if the grade of the neuroendocrine tumor is a little bit higher. One of you asked a question a little bit earlier, what is the likelihood of receptor expression? There is some likelihood. We want to know for those patients, is there a role for PRRT? Azedra is now approved for para and FIO. We want to know, will it help other neuroendocrine patients as well? Teletrostat is used to help carcinoid patients who are having intractable diarrhea from this syndrome, and they're looking at ways to see whether it'll slow the disease process, carcinoid heart disease. We're also interested in finding new therapies. This is all about existing things. In the new therapies bucket, we have the cabozantinib placebo study. Lenvatinib is another drug that has shown some promise in phase 2 that's moving to phase 3. Another drug, surufatinib, you heard about earlier, that the Asian colleagues showed some excitement, some results that looked positive. And we're now looking at ways to not just target the somatostatin receptor with agonists, but also with antagonists to see, can we somehow take that receptor and turn it into a good leverage it to be beneficial to you. And this vaccine as well that I just mentioned. Continuing on, what other trials are we doing? What other questions are we trying to answer? We're still trying to figure out how to report and what part of that net spot or gallium dotatate scan is most beneficial in allowing us to pick patients who will do well. And earlier in this meeting that we had, one of the doctors, Lisa Baudet, presented that she's been looking at a NET test. It's a blood test, and that's been helping predict who's going to recur or benefit from PRRT. So some of these are biomarker research studies that we're doing. And last, but perhaps not the least, are the questions that really pertain to you much more than a lot of these things on an everyday basis, which is questions relating to cost of care, quality of life, and then refining outcome measures. When we say something shrank, we say it's 20% or 30% smaller. But to you, quality of life is important. Your symptoms getting better is important. And all of those things need to be incorporated and measured, because when you come and ask us, is this a good option for me? We should be ready with those answers to tell you. Other things that are also being looked at, because of rare diseases having few patients and few trials, large databases serve as a great way to answer some questions relatively quickly. Kind of like how Dr. Nakakura mentioned, understanding disparities was an important question that we were able to try to address a little bit using the SEER database. So some of those questions and research ideas are currently growing and gaining more momentum. And last but not the least, this meeting, we also had someone from the University at Buffalo. She's an engineer, and she is looking at ways to grade grade the pathology, grading of the tumor using computer techniques, automated methods. Because sometimes when the pathologist is looking, they could be seeing cells that are proliferating but not tumor, or the stain didn't pick up right, and having a computer do it and do it much quicker in a couple of seconds as opposed to 10 minutes could be an upgrade or an advantage to better select people. Because some of you asked this question, does the grade change? But sometimes we wonder, did we grade it right in the first place? So all this stuff is going on, and many of these are funded. Some of the projects in the red section here are not formal clinical trials, but they are part of existing clinical trials, or they're funded through various grants. So we'll close now in a couple of minutes with these 2 points. In clinical trials, patient-driven outcomes has become a big focus of research, not just in neuroendocrine cancer, but in all cancers. And improving both education for providers, patients, caregivers, and providing all relevant knowledge to individualize therapy is important. NANETS is doing this by having regional education conferences, 5 or 6 of them all over the country, so that doctors that don't see as much neuroendocrine and can't come to this meeting get the knowledge brought right to them. And lots of global surveys have been done. Dr. Simran Singh is a physician, a medical oncologist in Toronto, and he's done a lot of work in this area, asking patients, what's important to you? What are your symptoms? What do you need? And I'll share some of that. All of these tools, these quality of life tools, need to be incorporated in phase 3 studies so that then we can tell you how it impacted your life. Because in real life, not all patients are those trial patients. And lastly, last but not the least, there is a lot of room for studies in disparities and impact of age, because the average patient who goes on a clinical trial is a lot younger than the patient who's actually facing this disease. So this is that study I was mentioning briefly that Simran Singh did. About 1,900 patients from 12 countries answered a lot of questions about their care. And just a couple of answers here. The most frequent symptoms, he said, patients report is fatigue and diarrhea, abdominal pain and cramping being the next. And one of you asked earlier about neurological symptoms. It's not well characterized, so we don't know what to say. But when you look at this question, way down at about 19%, yes, many people have been reporting some memory loss and confusion, and whether that's secondary to stress or what it is, we need to understand. And when patients are asked, what are your needs? What do you really want? Certainly more treatments is number 1, better access to an expert in treatments is number 2, and more information about participation in trials. And that's what you all have always asked for. And I hope this is just one way to get that to you. But importantly, once these drugs are approved, you still need to be able to get them. For that median survival to improve, it's not just the trial patients who have to do well. All of you have to do well. And when you look at this survey, when they asked them how many patients have access to surgery, only 80% said they have access. When they asked them how many patients have access to chemo, only 40% said yes. So is that real, or is that something that we really need to help educate patients? No, you have access. We need to help you to get it. And this is a bank that we've set up at Roswell where we're trying to collect information from patients and samples that you may have surgery in different centers that is now not being used by anybody for doing some of the research that you've heard about earlier. In addition, we'll be collecting some immune cells so that we can understand how the immune system recognizes this cancer and why people do well or not so well if that immune system is playing a big role. And this is the accrual or enrollment of the first 180 or so patients 3 months after we started. New York, of course, we have the most because that's local. And then we'll close here by looking at, how can we get more trials to open? Federal funding has been a big part of clinical trials and research as a whole. But when you look at the impact federal funding has had on all cancer, while that is great, for some of the rarer cancers, it hasn't been as much. We've seen prolongation in survival. We've seen many good things come out of this federal funding, and some of it may or may not apply to you today, but it is worth paying attention to, because some of the things they found is that a web-based tool for self-reporting symptoms improves survival because you get access to care and attention to those symptoms sooner. They found for cancer-related fatigue, exercise and psychological support actually helps more than medications. So these are little things that have been found, but important in making you live better and live longer. And advocacy to help keep that funding is critical, and many organizations that you are part of or are involved in have been helping in a big way to make that happen. In addition, policies that make trials more inclusive. In the past, they would exclude patients who had HIV, young patients were excluded, but now the trials are a little bit more inclusive so everyone can benefit. And registries are being set up for the unusual outliers so that we can learn from them as well. So I'll close with just this one slide. Knowledge is power, and together we have the power to create new knowledge by participating in trials, fundraising. These are some of those ways. A lot of what I discussed or presented is what I think is going on in the field, but there's so much more that needs to happen with food, supplements, genes, exercise, and there's lots more we still need to learn. We need to focus on access. We need to get all of you access to everything, as well as your teams that are caring for you. And also focus on prevention. If there's anything we can do to modify your diet and reduce the risk of prevention, reduce the risk of recurrence, we should be focusing on that. Quality of life, not having expensive copays, things that we can do to make that better is also something we need to do. And the immune system, as you've heard today a few times already, is a big part of how people live longer and really get cured. We have much more work to do in addition to personalizing, individualizing therapies. And everyone wants to help. I know each of you is willing to do this because of the benefit you may get, but also to pay it forward. We just all need to know how to do it and how to collaborate. And I just want you to leave with a feeling of hope, because trust us, we're all trying, and your participation and us doing together whatever we're doing, discoveries are happening. You just don't know them every day. So thank you.